What's up guys, Asian here again with a build video, and today we're going to be going over the Sorcerer Healer. So the Sorcerer Healer is a spec that you're going to see very often in endgame trials guilds, mainly because magicka Sorcerer DPS at this point don't really match up to what a magicka Nightblade is able to pull, particularly in Execute. However, you still want to have that Liquid Lightning synergy for your tanks in order to maintain outclash uptimes and things like that. So a lot of people, endgame guilds particularly, are shifting towards a Sorcerer Healer role, mainly because the Sorcerer Healer will be able to provide a little bit more DPS to the group with Liquid Lightning and Blockade and things like that, as well as continuing to provide the Liquid Lightning synergy. It opens up a DPS slot for a magicka Nightblade or a Stamina Nightblade, depending on what type of trial you're running, and their healing output is still pretty comparable to that of a Templar or a Warden. It's going to be a little bit lower just because Sorcs don't really have a source of minor or major mending, but their healing power is still perfectly adequate to kind of clear most, if not all, content in the game at that high-end level. So, just like the rest of our build videos, we'll be going over our gear, our attributes, our mundus, our CP points, everything you need to know to basically recreate this build. I'll be talking about kind of my approach to healing, and I will also be kind of discussing a couple of alternatives here and there. As a support role, you do have to be very flexible with your gear sets, with your skills and things like that. So I will be kind of pointing out flex spots, other sort of skills you might want to wear, other gear sets that you should pick up along the way, just to make sure that you're fully prepared for any situation that comes at you. So we're going to start things off first with our gear. So like I said, gear is going to be very kind of trial dependent. It's also going to be dependent on your group needs, con that you're running, and things like this. But this is kind of what I like to fall back to on pretty much all of my healers when I really don't know what I'm going to necessarily be running for the night. So I like to start off with Bogdan's. So I do have a 5-1-1 here, so I do have a heavy head and medium shoulders. Doesn't really matter which one goes where. I do have Bogdan's as my monster helm set. And you do have a couple of other options when it comes to what are the sort of monster helm sets you want to wear. There's Earthgore, there's something like Rkugamz. Those are the two most common alternatives, but in my opinion, Bogdan is going to be at the very least the most consistent. Even though it's only a 5% chance to heal, it's every single heal that you do has a 5% chance. So if you have Illustrious healing or healing springs going, if you have like blood altar going, each one of those ticks does have a chance to proc Bogdan. So Bogdan actually has a higher uptime than it initially might seem, because it's not every single heal, it's not every cast, it's every single time you heal somebody. So if you also heal 6 people at the same time, that's 6 independent 5% chances to get that proc happening. So it can proc more often than you think. Now, the other two monster helm sets that I mentioned, the first one is Earthgore. Earthgore is a very bursty heal. So the one piece adds 2% healing done, which is always nice to have here. But the two piece is just a very large burst heal over 6 seconds every 35 seconds. The big downside of running Earthgore is that 35-second cooldown. So you're really going to want to make sure to use Earthgore in situations where you need that burst heal, and situations where you don't necessarily need to worry so much about the cooldown. So you'll often see Earthgore being run in places like Cloud Rest or Asylum, mainly because that burst heal is going to be more important. It allows you to play a little bit more aggressively. The tank can play a little bit more aggressively if it procs on them. DPS can play a little bit aggressively if they know that they have that Earthgore heal going. So that's one instance where you might want to use Earthgore. Now the other set is going to be something of Rkugamz. This is kind of more used for very endgame level guilds where you have a lot of stamina DPS. And that's because the spider does restore stamina to everybody within 5 meters of where it spawns. It will spawn pretty much right on top of the person that it procs on. So it's very similar to Bogdan's, where it's a 10% chance to proc, but it's a 10% chance to proc on every single heal. So if you're throwing down a healing springs that hit 6 people, each of those heals 6 people, you have 6 independent 10% chances to proc Sentinel. So this is very nice for stamina sustain. It's going to be very useful now that Orcs and Dunmer are kind of the stamina meta races. They don't really have any sustain passive, so having additional stamina return from Rkugamz is going to be very helpful. But again, this is very niche because this is mostly used by endgame guilds that have a lot of stamina DPS. If you have like 4 magicka, 4 stamina, it might still be useful to have this. The stamina obviously helps out your tanks and your stamina DPS, and being able to dodge roll more often is always very nice as a magicka DPS, who typically have lower stamina pools. But it does lose a little bit of power in those instances, just because obviously there's less stamina DPS that'll be able to make use of the additional stamina sustain there. So those are your monster helm set options, but again, I like Bogdan the best. You will notice that I do have a prismatic enchant on my helm, and I do like to have prismatics on all of my large pieces, so that's my legs and chest. So for my body set, I have Olorime's perfect set here. You can go with the imperfect version, so it's kind of up to you whether you have this or not. I already have seen plenty of arguments about spell power cure versus Olorime. Olorime is just the superior sets. There have been plenty of endgame videos out there, I should say videos out there by endgame individuals, Nephis, myself, Heal the Fields, that pretty much go over why Olorime is the superior set. You can feel free to argue in the comments below, but just rest assured that Olorime is widely considered to be vastly superior to spell power cure by pretty much any healer that runs vet trials. You do want to pick up Olorime at some point. So this does come from Cloud Rest, so you will need to have the Somerset expansion in order to get this set here. That being said, you can run Spell Power Cure in the meantime while you're trying to get this set, but you do want to replace Spell Power Cure with Olorime as soon as you can. Like I mentioned, you can go with the imperfect version. The perfect version adds the additional max magicka on the 5-piece. The imperfect version doesn't have that, so that's just a little bit of an extra bonus here. Now, in terms of armor traits, you'll notice that I have all divines. You can go with infused on all of your large pieces too if you would like. It's kind of up to you how you want to play that out. The divines will obviously help boost your Mundus Stone, but the infused will give you a little bit more oomph, more return out of your prismatic enchants there. So you only want them on your large piece, not on your small piece. Now for your small pieces, this should be a max magicka enchant, but all of your small pieces should have max magicka. Now, you can actually swap these out for health or stamina depending on what you need in the moment, so it's kind of up to you, but max magicka across all of your small pieces is typically going to be the way to go. Now for our second set, I am running Infallible Aether. This is dropped from any of the 3 Crowdlorn trials. So Infallible Aether, while the set bonuses themselves, 2, 3, 4-piece in particular, don't really seem to be very geared towards healing, it's the 5-piece that's really powerful for healers. So enemies you damage with a fully charged heavy attack are afflicted with minor vulnerability for 10 seconds, increasing the damage taken by 8%. So in the damage calculations, damage taken is calculated separately from damage done. So it doesn't stack with minor berserk additively, it stacks with it multiplicatively. So it does end up doing more than that 8% typically speaking when you kind of consider it with all your other sort of damage modifiers there. So it's really, really nice to have this basically almost guaranteed chance of proccing minor vulnerability. You don't have to do a fully charged heavy attack. The wording's a little bit says it does, but you can actually just, as long as you are starting that heavy attack channel with a lightning staff or a healing staff, you will be able to apply that minor vulnerability. So this is very, very powerful, very, very useful for endgame vet trials groups. So a lot of vet trials groups will try to have a healer or even both healers in Infallible Aether here. Now, for my jewelry enchants, you have a few options here. So I have 2 of the most common traits here. So Arcane and Infused are going to be 2 of the more common traits that you'll see for jewelry traits for healers. Infused will give you a stronger enchant bonus. So you can see here that my magicka regen enchant is 270 compared to the base 169. So that's always nice to have. And then obviously Arcane gives you more resources, which helps out your sustain and also improves your healing power as well, because it does also scale off of your max magicka. For enchants, again, I have 2 very common options here, magicka regen and spell damage. For me, personally, I try to get them pretty close together. I try to get at least 2,000 pre-buffed if I can. Obviously here I'm falling a little bit short, but it's perfectly fine right now, because if I do decide to get buff up with major intellect and major sorcery for my potions, for example, you'll see that I am above that 2,000 kind of threshold there that I kind of set for myself. You don't necessarily need to kind of meet that. Obviously you can spec more towards magicka regen if you need to sustain. You can stat more into spell damage if your sustain is fine. It's kind of up to you how you want to play around with that. For our weapons, obviously we're going 1 Resto and 1 Destro Staff. You can go double Resto if you'd like, but typically speaking you'll be going Restoration Staff and a Destruction Staff. Destruction Staff will be a Lightning Staff here. So I have the Asylum's Perfected Restoration Staff on the front bar. You can go with the imperfect version if you would like. You can also use the Massive Restoration Staff if you would like. Let me see if I can find it here. You can do the Massive Restoration Staff too if you would like. The 2-piece is down there. So the Massive Restoration Staff comes from Dragonstar Arena, so you're able to get this pretty much in the base game. It is fairly difficult to kind of clear this, especially if you're a new player, but most groups, especially with the power creep now, it's fairly easy to clear it. You can normally get it within an hour and a half. You have 4 chances to get it because you have 4 people in Dragonstar Arena, so chances are you only need 1 or 2 runs to get a Master's Restoration Staff. The Asylum staff, on the other hand, this does come from the Clockwork City DLC from the Trial Asylum Sanctorium. The perfected version is a lot more difficult to get than the imperfect version, but the difference between them is very, very small. The imperfect version has a 27% reduction versus a 30% from the perfected version. So again, very, very small, only 3% difference there. In terms of enchants and traits, so very similar to jewelry, you do have a lot of different options when it comes to the traits that you want to run on your staves here. So I have Decisive on the front bar for some additional ultimates, so that way I can get my Warhorn a little bit faster. Especially as a Sorc, you already have 15% reduced ultimate cost. Your Warhorn order costs 213, compared to 250 for any for your typical tank, DK tank, or 240 for your Templar. So it is nice to have that faster ultimate generation here. I have in charge on the back bar here, so because I do have that shock enchant there, and I'll go into that a little bit in a little bit. Some other options that you might want to consider for traits, and again, this is going to be very dependent on what your group wants, what sort of content you're running, things like that. You go with Infused for a stronger enchant bonus, so you can, by all means, that's perfectly fine. You can go with Powered for more heals. If you're going to go with Powered, typically you're going to want that on your Restoration staff bar, just because obviously all your healing abilities, your main primary healing abilities, will be on that Resto staff bar instead. Something you just want to keep in mind there. And then another potential option is going to be Defending if you want that little bit additional survivability, but generally speaking, I don't really find Defending to be all that useful. It's more useful to kind of be more aware of the mechanics, know why you're dying, and try to avoid those cases that way. But you can go with Defending if you would like. I used to run Defending maybe 4 or 5 patches ago when I was learning to heal and learning Vet Trials, but once you get more experience, these other traits are going to be a lot stronger here. Now in terms of enchants, you have a lot of different enchants, but there is one enchant that you should probably try to keep, and that's going to be the Shock enchant on your Lightning Staff bar. The Shock enchant is the only source, or I should say the most consistent source, of proccing the status effect Concussed, which is required for the off-balance status effect on any sort of boss. Now, if you have a lot of stamina DPS, off-balance is very important because of the Exploiter passive under the Ritual CP, just Constellation. That basically increases the damage done on off-balance enemies by 10%. Stamina DPS, because of the way they allocate their CP, will always have this Exploiter passive. For magicka DPS, this is less of a concern because you typically will not have that Exploiter passive active as magicka DPS. That being said though, off balance is still very useful for magicka DPS because if an enemy is off balanced and you heavy attack them while they're off balance, you actually gain twice as many resources when you finish your heavy attack. So it's still useful, it's just not quite as useful for magicka DPS compared to stamina DPS. So you do want that shock enchant there in order to get that concussed uptime. So that's why we have the charge in the back bar as well, because the base chance to proc concuss is 20% with the destruction staff passives, that boosts up to 40%, and then with charge that boosts up even further, so it's pretty much almost completely guaranteed that you're going to get this proc. I believe with the passive and charge, I believe you're sitting at about 84% chance to proc every time your shock damage enchant goes off, so that's why shock enchant is going to be very, very important there. Now for the front bar enchant, this is where you have a couple more options here. So I have the standard Absorb Magicka enchant to help out our sustain. That's all obviously going to be very useful if you do need help with sustaining. You do have several other options. So with the change to one-handed enchants, Crusher might be an option for healers, at least for certain groups. In cases where the tanks might not necessarily have good Crusher uptime, healers might want to run Crusher instead or in conjunction with the tanks. That way they have the full strength Crusher up, because staves do count as two-hand, and so you still have that full Crusher strength. If you are going to be doing this though, you will need to have Infused on the Crusher, whatever weapon you have the Crusher enchant on. Weakening is another option here. This is more for progression style guilds because it does reduce the damage incoming to your group, always very useful. And then you have the weapon damage enchant, which helps boost the strength of your heals by increasing your spell damage. Heals do scale for spell damage, so the higher your spell damage is, the more healing you're able to output. So again, very nice to have this sort of weapon damage enchant there in the back of your mind. And of course the Absorb Magicka enchant if you do decide, I just want to just get more sustain. Now in terms of other set options here, so you do have several set options, and I'm going to break these into two different sort of groups. So you have the body set, which is basically sets that you want to wear on the body, because the 5-piece either doesn't last long enough to be considered a back bar set, or it is not a proc. And then you have back bar sets, which are very similar to Infallible Aether, where you can have the 5-piece on the back bar and it's not that big of a deal. You don't need to have it double barred or anything like that. Now, backbar sets, you can double bar them. You can just replace this Asylum Restoration Staff with, for example, a Restoration Staff of Infallible Aether if you'd like. You would be giving up that Asylum Restoration Staff bonus, but it's up to you. Some healers have completely foregone the Master's Resto and the Asylum's Resto, so it's really up to you how you want to play that out. So your other sets, let's start going through them. First one's going to be Mending. This is going to be a body set, so you're going to want to wear this as your body. This just helps reduce incoming damage. It procs off of any area effect heal ability, which is pretty much almost all healing abilities in the game, except for maybe a handful of them, which are only single target heals. It says it reduces weapon damage, but this reduces all damage from PvE enemies, so bosses and things like that. So more useful for progression style guilds where you want to reduce the incoming damage to your group. We already talked about Infallible Mage. Jorvuld's Guidance, this can be a body set or a backbar set. I've seen it more commonly used as a backbar set or in conjunction with Olorime. But it's kind of up to you how you want to play around with this. This basically increases the duration of any major buffs, minor buffs, and damage shields you apply to yourself and allies by 40%. So for damage shields, it's the duration, not the strength. So if it's a 10-second damage shield for 4,000, with Jorvuld's Guidance, it becomes a 10,000 damage shield I should say 4,000 damage shield for 14 seconds instead. So it's the duration, not the strength of your damage shield. So Jorvuld is strong because of that major force buff from Warhorn. That gets buffed from 9.5 seconds to about 13.5 seconds instead. I think it's a little bit less than 13 seconds. But it adds basically an additional 4 seconds onto major force that way, which is a pretty nice DPS boost because you have a little bit more time now to kind of make use of that major force buff. It does not affect the additional resources, the 10% additional magicka and stamina you get, but it does affect that major force uptime. Keep it on going, trying to find all these sets here. Let's see, there's one more, I believe, one or two more. Sanctuary, this is a set that you want to pick up. It's going to be very situational because of that very small radius, so it's only within 10 meters and it increases healing received. Now in ESO, it is actually pretty easy to heal in terms of just pure healing per second. It is very easy to end up overhealing in this game. So Sanctuary does not have as much strength as the other sets or as much utility as the other sets, but it is still very useful for some niche scenarios. So for example, in Cloud Rest, a lot of progression groups like to have Sanctuary on one of the healers in order to help heal through Baneful Mark during Execute. So you do want to pick this up, but just recognize that this is going to be a limited use set. And the final set here is somewhere down here. The Worm, so this comes from Vault of Madness. This is basically just magicka sustained for magicka DPS. It reduces the cost of magicka abilities by 4% for you and up to 11 other group members within 28 meters of you. So this is a body set because obviously you don't want it to only be active on one bar. So very nice to have for magicka sustain. If you're running with a lot of stamina DPS, you won't want to be running the Worm. If you are actually going to be running with all stamina DPS, there is one set that you might want to consider picking up in jewelry and weapons. So this would be Hircine's Veneer. So this is basically the stamina version of Worm Cult. So if you do decide to go with Hircine's Veneer, you will need to double bar this. So this is a medium armor set, so you can't wear it on the body unless you're a stamina healer for whatever reason. So you will need to get the jewelry and the resto and lightning staff. That's kind of the downside of running Hircine's Veneer. Also, the 2, 3, 4 piece bonuses are not very conducive to magicka healing, so that's just something you want to keep in mind. But it is something that you might want to consider picking up. It's not going to be used all too often though, because a lot of stamina DPS do have decent enough sustain, especially when you consider orbs and some of Rkugamz. That's it for gear. Let's go ahead and go over a character sheet. So I am a Breton. Bretons are going to be one of the 2 top races for healing. The other one's going to be the Argonians. So Bretons have 7% cost reduction to any magic ability they use, which is very, very nice for sustain. So very powerful for being able to sustain. You can spec a little bit lower into magicka regen and a little bit higher into spell damage this way. The other option, Argonians, have additional healing, I believe it's healing done. So they're very strong in terms of being able to put out more heals. So conversely to the Bretons, you're able to spec a little bit lower into spell damage and a little bit higher into magicka regen. Argonians also do have a passive that gives them resources, all 3 resources whenever they drink a potion. So that just really helps out their sustain that way. So every single spell power potion that you drink heals the base magicka that potion gives, alongside of about 4,000 resources from the Argonian passive itself. So very, very powerful, very, very nice for sustain that way. In terms of Mundus, I'm using the Ritual, which increases healing done. You can go with the Atronach, which increases your magicka regen. So you can pick, again, sustain versus healing strength. So if I have the Ritual, so I can spec a little bit more into magicka regen if I need to, because I do have additional healing done with the Ritual. For food, I'm running Clockwork Citrus Fillet. You can run Witch Mothers instead. You should only use Clockwork Citrus Fillet if you have prismatic enchants on your large pieces because of that lower health bonus. If you don't have prismatic, you can go with something called Orzagar's Red Hrothgar instead. That gives you 5,000 max health as well as 459 magicka regen, so it just gives you a little bit more resources this way. But Clockwork Citrus Fillet and Witch Mothers both give max magicka, which helps boost your overall strength of heals as well as sustain by giving you larger resource pools. Those are basically your two options there for food. You can go with Clockwork / Witch Mothers for kind of a more balanced approach. You're sacrificing a little bit of health, a little bit of magicka regen for some increased healing power. Or you can go with Orzagar's Red Hrothgar, where you're giving up that max magicka, but you're gaining some more max health and magicka regen that way. Now going over our skills, starting off with our Resto Staff bar. We have Energy Orbs, the strongest healing move in the game right now. We have Illustrious Healing. You can go with the other morph, which is Healing Springs if you'd like. Illustrious Healing will give you more heals per second. Healing Springs will give you more sustain because it does restore magic on your first tick of Healing Springs. So it's kind of up to you which one you want to use. If you can sustain Illustrious Healing, then this is going to be the better morph. Otherwise, you can go ahead and stick with Healing Springs instead. Combat Prayer for the Mind Berserk. You have Liquid Lightning. This is for the Conduit synergy. Make sure to drop this on the boss / tank to make sure they have that synergy for Alkosh there. Then we have Bound Aegis. This is a flex spot, and I'll go over your flex options in a little bit. And for ultimate, I have Absorption Field. Again, this is kind of a flex spot. You do have several other ultimates you can potentially use instead of Absorption Field. But this is nice. The heal from it is actually pretty strong. So in here, you can see here, without any buffs or anything like that, we're already sitting at almost 3,000 health per second, 3,000 HPS. So it's pretty strong, but you're not really going to be using this ultimate too much unless you really need that additional healing output. For your back bar, we have Daedric Tome, and this is to help proc our dark magic passive called Exploitation, which gives us Minor Prophecy. So you do need to use this at least once every 20 seconds or so. Elemental Drain for your magicka sustain. If you have all stamina, obviously you can drop this and use a different skill. Blockade of Storms. This is for the off balance as well as helping to proc your shock enchant on the back bar. Overflowing Altar for minor lifesteal as well as the additional Blood Feast synergy. And then Bound Aegis. Again, this is a flex spot, so if you don't have any other abilities you need to use, then you can use Bound Aegis on both bars. Otherwise, you can replace this with a different ability. An Aggressive Warhorn for that major force uptime. So for your flex spots, again, you do have a few flex spots here. So you don't want the Tormentor, you want the other morph of the Tormentor. Let me see if I have... Just pick up the respec scroll real quick. You want the other morph of the Tormentor, which is the Matriarch. So this needs to be double barred because it is a pet, but this is basically your Sorc burst heal. So this is basically the Breath of Life for Sorcs. Now the downside is, it is a pet, it is invincible in trials, so you don't have to worry about it dying all the time, but it is a pet, so you do have to keep that in mind. This is a nice burst heal if you do want to have that burst heal option there. Another thing that you might want to pick up, especially if you're having trouble surviving, is going to be Bound of Storm for the major ward and major resolve. Very nice to have the additional survivability there, so if you do feel like you're dying a little bit more often, you can pick up Bound of Storm as well. Under the Restoration Staff, you can use the ultimate here. You can go... I like Light's Champion instead. This would obviously be on your front bar in place of Absorption Field. This is going to be more used for 4-man content, less so for 12-man content like Trials. For 4-man content, you can also run something like Mutagen or Rapid Regen if you'd like. You can also run Healing Ward if you'd like. It did lose that initial heal, I think last patch or 2 patches ago, so it's not quite as strong, but you can double cast it to get that heal right away if you'd like. Those are your options there. Obviously, if you need a shield, you can also just use the shield that you have right here. I like to run Empowered Ward as a healer for that minor intellect to everybody. Just to give you a little bit more utility. You do have slightly less of a max shield, but the minor intellect is also very important as well. Alright, and I believe there's a few more here. Bone Surge for the synergy here. This is only useful if you're stacking in group. If you're not stacking in group, Bone Surge is obviously not going to be useful at all. Then you can also run Efficient Purge if you need a Purge on any fights. And then you can also run any morph of the Barrier morph. So Reviving Barrier heals, Replenishing Barrier gives you ultimate and magicka, so I like Reviving Barrier just for the additional heal. Again, this would be a front bar ultimate there. Now going over our champion points. I step here. So just respec everything real quick. You want 75 in Arcanist and 75 in Tenacity. You can go all the way up to 100 if you would like. That'd give you a little bit more oomph out of these 2 points, but then you do lose some utility on the other nodes. That will give you the remainder about 100. What is it now? It will give you 120 points. So I do 40 Warlord, 40 Tumbling, 40 Shadow Ward. Just kind of go for a balanced approach, but depending on the count that you're running, you might want to redistribute them accordingly. Oh, my CPs are all screwed up here. So for blue CPs, I'm just going to really quickly redo them real quick. There's only 2 CP point nodes that you really need to focus on. Blessed and Elfborn, because obviously you're a magicka healer and you're doing healing. So 100 here, and that gives you 70 points, and you can really put them wherever. So you can kind of focus in a little bit more on spell erosion if you'd like, maybe a couple points into elemental expert, maybe a few points into thaumaturge. So you can go with that, but the most important thing is 100 here. Now if you don't want to waste those extra points, you can go 75 blessed and then 81 Elfborn instead. That'll give you 14 and 24. Then you can put the remaining 44 points that you saved again into any of the DPS CPs. So you can go like 49 LA Expert, you can put a couple of the Mastered Arms now, you can push up Thaumaturge a little bit, so those are an example here. Now for red CPs, this is a kind of more balanced approach, so depending on the content that you're running, you might need to use different CP distributions. So for example, in Maw, you're going to want to focus more on magical defenses, so you might want to take some points out of Hardy, for example, and put them into Spell Shield. But for the balanced approach, 81 Ironclad, 61 Thick Skin, and 64 Hardy into Elemental Defender. And that is pretty much it for champion points and the build itself. Now I'm going to talk a little bit about my healing perspective, how I go about healing. So obviously as a healer, as a support role, you don't really have a parse. Instead, you kind of have what I like to call priorities, whether that's buffing somebody first, debuffing the enemy, healing. So you kind of have to take those priorities into account. So as a healer, I mentioned this earlier, but it's actually very easy to overheal into this game, and it's kind of a trap that a lot of new healers fall into, which is, I'm a healer, I should focus in on healing. That's not necessarily going to be the case here in ESL. For those of you guys who are used to healing in other MMOs, where your job is really just to heal, healers in ESO are more buffing and debuffing, with healing kind of mixed in there as well. So you're responsible for 3 different jobs. Buffing your allies, this primarily goes through Combat Prayer, any sort of set that you're running, Aggressive Warhorn, Liquid Lightning to help out your tanks a little bit. And then you're also going to be responsible for debuffing. So if you're running Infallible Aether, making sure you have Minor Vulnerability on the boss, trying to get off balance up by having Shock your Blockade Storms down all the time, making sure Minor Lifesteal is on with Alter. And then healing is obviously your 3rd job. You just want to make sure nobody's dying. So you have all your healing abilities, Energy Orbs, Combat Prayer, things like that. So my approach to healing is I heal as much as I need to make sure nobody dies, and in every other kind of instance there, I'm kind of focusing on maintaining my buffs. So Combat Prayer is going to be your most important buff for that Minor Berserk. Minor Berserk is very important, especially for non-Nightblades. Nightblades and Wardens both have innate sources of Minor Berserk, but if you have Sorks, DKs, or Templars in the group, you will need to run Combat Prayer, and you need to make sure to provide it to your DPS for that Minor Berserk uptime. Now if you have the Asylum Restoration staff like I do, typically when you go with Combat Prayer, you have a couple of seconds to push out orbs. You can get 2 orbs off at a reduced cost because of the Asylum benefit there. So you just want to do Combat Prayer, 2 orbs, sometimes you should throw out 3 if you'd like, it's kind of depending on what you want to do. I like to make sure there's always an orb out on the field at all time. Like I mentioned earlier, orbs is actually the strongest healing move in the game. Just in terms of raw heals done per second, orbs is pretty much unmatched by any other ability in the game outside of ultimates, obviously. So make sure to try to keep an orb out at all times. Even if it's popped, just throw out another one right away. If you're like in the middle of Combat Prayer, then that's fine. You can just throw out an orb, or you can recast Combat Prayer early, so you have that cost reduction if you have the Asylum Restoration staff. It's kind of up to you how you want to do that. The other thing you want to make sure to keep up, obviously Elemental Drain on the boss. That way you're able to, get that major breach and minor magicka steal up. And then Blockade is also very important if you have stamina DPS. Pretty much all these abilities are very important to maintain, with the exception obviously being Illustrious healing / healing springs. Liquid Lightning goes on the tank for that Alclash uptime, so that's going to be really important. Blockade for the off balance. Now Blockade also helps proc your backbar enchant as well. Off balance does have a 15-second cooldown, so it's 5 seconds off balance, 15-second cooldown, and then 5 seconds again, so you don't necessarily need to maintain Blockade up at all times. I recommend doing so anyways, just so that way you're always proccing your enchant on the backbar, or you have it, yeah, you always have that enchant going. So I like to keep it up, but it's not necessarily something that you need to maintain 100% uptime on. It's a nice goal to shoot for, but you don't need to get for that. Then of course Blood Altar for that minor lifesteal. There's a cast time associated with it, so just be mindful of that when it comes to mechanics, having to avoid mechanics and things like that. Now in terms of Daedric Mines, when do you want to use it? You want to use it every 20 seconds or so. The minor prophecy buff that you'll be giving by using this lasts for 20 seconds, so you just want to, every once in a while, 15-20 seconds or so, just pop it on the boss. You do a little bit of DPS this way, and you give your magicka DPS the minor prophecy. Now if you're running all stamina, you obviously don't need the minor prophecy bonus, so you can just completely axe this move and put on any of the other flex moves that I mentioned earlier. So that's pretty much it for this build video. If you guys have any questions, please feel free to leave them down in the comment section below. I don't typically run Sword healers on live. I typically run my Templar or Warden healer, so I'm not quite as familiar with Sword healers. If you want to see more footage of Sword healers in action, I highly recommend checking out Style Anima. She is a Sword healer for a lot of very high-end PvE guilds, both on PCNA and PCEU. You can also check out a couple of other healers as well. I believe Heals the Field and Tabata might also have Sword healer perspective videos. They typically play more Templar Wardens, but I know Tabata, I believe, has healed on a sword before, so there's a couple of other options there. Hope you guys found this video informative. Again, if you guys have any questions or comments about this build, please feel free to leave them down in the comment section below. Again, hope you guys found this video informative, and I'll see you guys in the next dungeon.